Cool. My name is Radhika, and I have the distinct honor to introduce author and Pulitzer Prize winner Eli Saslow this evening. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that Oregon State University is located within the traditional homelands of the Marys River, or the Wampanoag Band of Kalapuya. Following the Willamette Valley Treaty of 1855, the Kalapuya people were forcibly removed to reservations in western Oregon. Today, living descendants of these people are a part of the Confederate Tribes of the Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederate Tribes of the Siletz Indians. Thank you. Journalist and author Eli Saslow is known for writing about a plethora of divisive issues, ranging from racism and poverty to school shootings and other major national issues. Saslow has been a longtime staff writer for the Washington Post and has also co-founded a writing-focused nonprofit organization called Press Pass Mentors, specifically for underrepresented high school students located in Washington, D.C. Saslow was also the T. Anthony Pollner Distinguished Professor of Journalism at the University of Montana and has spoken at a variety of universities throughout the nation. He graduated from Syracuse University with several honors and currently lives in Portland, Oregon with his family. Thank you for coming to Beaver Nation today. Before we get started with the interview, I would like to also provide a bit of background information about Dr. Eliza Barstow, who will be leading this discussion. Dr. Barstow currently teaches in the School of History, Philosophy, and Religion and is a scholar of American religious history. She teaches courses on U.S. religion, social reform, and gender. Currently, I'm taking an honors colloquia class with her that focuses on white nationalism in Oregon. In this course, we have been reading Saslow's Rising Above Hatred, which describes how polarizing white nationalism has become in our nation. It has also showcased how important and powerful open communication and active listening can truly be. Finally, I would like to thank all of our sponsors for helping put this event together. The list is a bit intensive, so please bear with me, but thank you to the School of History, Philosophy, and Religion, the School of Writing, Language, and Film, the Social Justice Education Initiative, the Search Advocate Program, the Difference, Power, and Discrimination Program, the Honors College, and the Office of Institutional Diversity. Now please help me give a warm welcome to Eli Saslow.
All right. Well, I actually am going to start with a question by Radhika, who just introduced both of us, and actually also a question authored by someone a bit younger, actually my 10-year-old daughter, who is sitting in the front row. And these questions aim to get us thinking about the scope of the book and why Eli Saslow shaped his project as he did. So Radhika, as she mentioned, is in my class on white supremacy and the state of Oregon. And so she asked, why did you specifically choose to write about Derrick Black when there are so many other prominent white nationalists in the course of American history? And I'm going to also say the question from my daughter Meg right now, because I think that these can be paired well together. And I should note that Meg has read the book. So this is coming from her sense of, just thinking about different ways you could shape such a book. And so she wants to know why the book is so focused on Derrick Black when it could have been shaped in a way that it was, say, like a chapter for one character and then another and then another. And so you would have sort of a merging of different voices. So really these are questions about how did you get into this project and how did you make some of the decisions you did?
Sure, cool, great questions. Really glad you got the front row seat that you were after. My main work is as a journalist for the Washington Post, where I have this very fortunate job in journalism where I'm doing really long, in-depth stories about usually the way the big issues in the country are impacting people's lives. And unfortunately, like in our current American moment, that job has meant writing a lot about racism, the endemic white supremacy that is still, unfortunately, a big part of our social structures in this country. And it's also meant writing increasingly about extremism. That's become part of my job. So 3 or 4 years ago, I was in Charleston, South Carolina, because somebody named Dylan Roof had self-radicalized, mostly on the internet, as a white supremacist, and then had gone into a historically black church in Charleston, South Carolina, and had murdered 10 people, a horrific hate crime. And Dylan Roof had gone into this church after spending a lot of time on a website called Stormfront. I'd heard of it, but I'd never spent time there before. I didn't know very much about it. So I decided to go on this website to read the things Dylan Roof had been reading before he went into this church. Stormfront, for those of you lucky enough not to know about it, is it's sort of like the largest racist forum on the internet. It's translated every day into 4 different languages. It's a place where KKK people and neo-Nazis and also self-described racist academics come and meet and talk about these dangerous ideas and ways to further them. So when I went on Stormfront, people were saying these horribly upsetting things about Dylan Roof and sort of celebrating what he had done. But the largest thread at that point on this message board was about somebody named Derrick Black, who I'd never heard of before. So that was kind of my introduction to this story. I clicked on this message thread and started to read. And in that way, quickly sort of saw the biographical outlines of this person's life. Derrick was born the son of the founder of this message board. Derrick's father, Don Black, had been the head of the Klan in America for 10 years, then had started this website. Derrick's godfather is a man named David Duke, probably the most notorious racist politician of modern times, although with some competition lately. These men had raised Derrick essentially to be the future heir to this movement. They'd pulled Derrick out of the public schools in Florida. Derrick spent his childhood traveling around to these racist conferences around the country. And because Derrick was really smart, because he was really ambitious, he then invested himself in these racist ideas in really disastrous ways. I mean, by the time Derrick was 16, 17 years old, he was the keynote speaker at these conferences, telling these racist radicals that the way ahead for their movement was not through slurs or cross-burning rallies, but instead through politics and through trying to mainstream this ideology by sanitizing the language of white supremacy from its very real history of bloodshed. So Derrick got a show on the radio, a mainstream radio show in Florida, where he and his father would talk about this stuff on the air for 2 hours every day. He started a racist website for kids, a white pride site for kids. He ran for office in Florida and won, got a seat on the county commission, basically based on a white nationalist platform, and was the rising, young, most prominent white supremacist in the world. Then, as I was reading on the message board about him, this community knew that he had left to go to college, sort of later in life at 20 years old, had gone to college, and had slowly become less active in this movement. And then from the people on Stormfront, what they knew is that Derrick had just sent a letter to the Southern Poverty Law Center, probably the largest nonprofit anti-racist organization in the country. Derrick had sent them a letter not only apologizing for what he had done, but sort of a point-by-point evisceration of white nationalism as an ideology, saying that he was going to commit himself to doing everything he could to fight back against it, fight back against his family, changing his name and moving across the country. And these people on Stormfront, what they knew of Derrick was that he had essentially disappeared. And they were at this point wondering, where is this person? What happened to change his mind? And what do we do to him if we can find him? So as a reporter in that moment, I think my curiosity was piqued in terms of why Derrick Black, because I also wanted to know what took the future heir to this movement, who was raised at its very epicenter, and had him emerge on this other end as somebody who wanted to devote his life to anti-racist work. How did that happen? And maybe in understanding how that happened, there would be some lessons and some things in there that would be useful for all of us in a country that I think is still very much in the process of confronting these racist ideas. To your awesome question about why that becomes the main narrative in the book, why it's mostly a story of this transformation, and I'm always very careful to talk about Derrick's story in this book not as a redemption story, but as a transformation story. The damage that Derrick caused and that this ideology continues to cause is so present and so real. This is not a story about redemption. It's a story about the active work that it took on this campus and in this community to confront these ideas and change this person's mind. And the fact that Derrick emerged on the other end is not a testament necessarily to doing something heroic or courageous, but instead to doing the fundamentally decent thing, which is saying that racism is a corrosive, disastrous force and trying to push back against it. So I felt like it was important to have all of these other perspectives in the story, but Derrick's, this journey of how he changes his mind is really the main narrative thrust. And that felt like, it had the most movement for the book to be like the beginning. Here's this person who is supposed to lead this movement. Everything in his life is about leading this movement. And then at the end, somebody who's like distanced himself from his family and now is fighting back against them at this point. So knowing that was the beginning and the end, the thread of the transformation felt like it would be the thing that was running through the whole book. Thanks for asking that.
Thank you. So, in order to really get at the content of Derrick Black's thought, there's two terms I really wanted us to be able to discuss with you, and they show really different ways of thinking about the concept of whiteness. So the first is one that was, for much of his adult life, until he disavowed white nationalism, a really important one to Derrick Black, one that he really heavily promoted and helped to really put into the white nationalist vocabulary, and that's the idea of white genocide. So I'd like you to say a little bit about what white nationalists mean when they refer to white genocide. The second is a term that Derrick and his father often laughed about. They found it ludicrous, something that only ridiculous liberals would say, and that's white privilege. But over time, Derrick comes to see that, wait, there is truth to the concept of white privilege. And so he comes to see, oh wait, there's not a white genocide, but there is white privilege. So what do these terms mean, and why are they so important to his thought?
Sure, yeah. So white genocide, I think probably at this point is maybe the most powerful conspiracy theory at the heart of white nationalist ideology. Derrick decided that essentially it was more powerful, instead of preaching an ideology purely of hate and saying to other white people, you need to hate people who are not like you, he tried to reframe this ideology around the idea of they are wiping you off the planet. And you, instead of fighting against them, you're fighting for your own survival, for your own future family's survival. And so that has turned into this idea of a white genocide. So, what white nationalists believe in their awful hierarchy of ideas is they think that, this is upsetting to say, but they believe that, minorities, people of color, are inferior to white people. That is not true in any way scientifically or anything else. That is their ideology. And they believe that Jews, who in many ways white nationalists identify as their primary enemy, they think Jews are propagating a scheme of multiculturalism to bring more white people into the United States to change the demographics of our country, so that over time there are a smaller amount of the population is white. This, they say, is a white genocide, and they turn this into like an action talking point, so that now, at the synagogue in Pittsburgh recently where there was a shooting, the shooter went into that synagogue, killed people, and came out saying, I'm here because there's a war underway, there's a white genocide underway, these people are killing my race, they're killing my people. And that's turned into a hugely powerful and dangerous rallying cry for people in this movement. White privilege, I think, is it's a complicated thing to talk about, but Derrick's realization now is that we live in a country that in many ways was founded on empowering the interests of white people. That is like what our history is steeped in. And in many ways, our social structures, whether it's our schools, our criminal justice system, our policing, still are built on white supremacist ideals that we have to do the active work of confronting. And so, it's difficult to talk about white privilege, and that especially in this moment in the country, in an urban-rural divide, there are many white people in the country who feel disenfranchised. Their lives are not privileged, and they feel like they are suffering for good reason. There are parts of the country that have not recovered still from the economic collapse, where drug overdoses are way on the rise, suicides are on the rise, life expectancy in the country for white people has gone down 3 years in a row. There is hurt in those places that is real. But what the problem that happens is when, instead of seeking the solutions to those problems, people come in and say the problem is because of these people. Like, it's these people coming across the border who are taking your jobs. That is why you're hurting. And that's also why I think we're at a very dangerous moment for this ideology, because there's a lot of oxygen for it to grow. And I think we're seeing a lot of that othering happening all around us.
Thank you. So in generating questions from my students, one of the things that was really of great interest to them came through with one student's question here. I'm going to read their question, Carly Connor's question, but it's also many other students' questions, really, about your experience of doing interviews with people like Don Black, whether that was emotionally scary, how that felt for you. So I'll read their words. Though you are an award-winning journalist who likely is trained to report objectively, did you ever encounter times working on this project where it was difficult to be objective, or the emotional aspect was hard to handle?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and something that is I think about a lot in all of my work, because my job, for the most part, really for the great privilege of my job is that it allows me to go spend time in communities that are totally unlike my own, with people that I wouldn't normally spend time with. That does not feel like a privilege when it means spending time with white supremacists. But like for this book, I knew that it was important to examine these ideas and the people who had spread them, to hopefully hold them up to the light for what they really are. It did not mean that part of the reporting was fun. Or sometimes that it was even comfortable. I mean, going and spending time with Don Black or David Duke or Richard Spencer, or anytime I would do it, I would text message my family, let them know, here's where I'm going to be. I'll be gone for this amount of time. Those people would look at my last name, Saslow, and say, what % Jewish are you? Who's Jewish in your family? Where does your family come from? It was often very uncomfortable, but. I never felt physically unsafe. I took precautions in terms of, locking down my own internet security and things like that. And I'm also always very cognizant of the fact that the real risks that were taken in this book were not mine. Like there are many people who became prominent in public in this book who did the active work of confronting the future heir to this movement. People who were already the victims of the prejudices of white nationalists, who are Jewish, are Orthodox, are recent immigrants to the country, Black, and they are fully named because they wanted to be in the work of confronting these ideas. The risk was much greater for all of them, so I think I try always to keep that in mind too.
Thank you.
Sure.
So you mentioned the people who confronted Derrick Black and really took on the project of talking to him about his racist ideology. So that leads to two questions here about that process. So like most readers, I find Derrick Black's story of transformation really inspiring, but I also finished it worried that maybe he was so unique that this wasn't something we could assume would happen of many other white nationalists, because he has this one particular attribute that I think might be pretty unusual for people in his circles. Specifically, he was and is genuinely interested in academic expertise. He went to college wanting to become a good historian. He changed his ideas about history, particularly medieval history, but also Islamic history because of his studies. And so he took seriously what he learned when he was assigned things like peer-reviewed journal articles written by trained historians. He also took seriously peer-reviewed, again, articles written by trained psychologists who could give scientific contributions to the discussion of whether race even exists, or people who would debunk the idea that there are IQ differentials in different races. And he read this and it made a difference. And so my concern is that many white nationalists might see academics as the leftist enemy. And I wonder to what extent this engagement with ideas is kind of unique to Derrick Black.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really great question. I would also say that I think sometimes we comfort ourselves by believing a stereotype of racism or racists in our country as like a trailer trash KKK leader. The much scarier truth is that a lot of these people are smart, which is scary. But Derrick, in his childhood, he grew up going to conferences of racist academics, racialists, as they would call themselves, where something called the American Renaissance Conference, which happens every year in Washington, D.C., where people who had PhDs would be presenting their scholarship furthering these racist ideas. I think that Derrick was unique in some ways, but unfortunately, intelligence and racist ideas often go hand in hand and are not mutually exclusive. I also think that Derrick, because even as a kid he had tried to explain this ideology to himself as something. Derrick never wanted to think of himself, even as a little kid, as hateful. He was, in many ways, he was indoctrinated with these ideas where he grew up. It wasn't like a gut prejudice that he had or was necessarily fostering. So he tried to make this ideology for himself something that was about science and something that was about facts and education. And so Derrick built his ideology on a false scaffolding. And it was comforting in writing and researching this book to know that the real science, the real biological facts are on the side of the anti-racist. Derrick had invested himself in these ideas about racial IQ differentials or testosterone differentials between races, and even like a false version of world history that totally prioritizes the idea of European warriors crusading for whiteness, that just does not hold up to a real study of the facts. And I think where Derrick was unique was that when people began to confront him with these ideas, he decided, oh, they're saying that these European warriors never thought of themselves as white. I'm going to go back through all these libraries in Europe and translate these old texts and see if I can find the origins of the phrase whiteness, which probably is not something that the normal person would do.
Thank you. So during the time that he changed his mind about these things, he was in college, and in the book, Allison, who becomes his girlfriend and is seemingly the most influential person, she is the most influential?
Definitely one of them, yeah.
And changing his mind when it comes to these things. She's getting a major in psychology, and then she goes on to become a psychologist. So she mentions the idea of fluid identity, that people between a certain age range, 18 to 25, are much more likely to be able to rethink their ideas and to really start anew, in a sense. And so, in a sense, I wonder then where that leaves most people who are out of that. And I should credit this question to Anna Breen, who is sitting right there, because she is actually the person who suggested that I ask that question. So she is another one of my students.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think Derrick, fluid identity is this idea that, when we're 18 to 25, that's the time in people's lives where they're, moving away from home, building some sense of identity. It is the time when we are most likely to challenge our major ideas about the world. So the fact that Derrick was able to make this change, I think, is in some ways unique. I also think, fortunately, his circumstances were unique. He was the future heir to this movement whose every relationship depended on furthering and supporting this racist cause. So it was, while he might have been in the time in his life where it was most natural for him to make this transition, he had so much further to travel than really almost anybody else, right? He was like the public spokesperson for this, and had to travel all the way out of it. I think the truth is, the much more pernicious, widespread threat to our country is the more mainstreamed racist ideas that are more widely held, and those are the people who, for the most part, we need to work on. I think polls consistently show, the stat in reporting this book that has stuck with me the most is the fact that these polls in the United States consistently show that about a third of white people in the country believe that they experience more discrimination, more prejudice than people of color or Jews. That is wildly factually inaccurate. It doesn't hold up to any of the statistics of where we are as a society. The fact that that much false white grievance exists, it gives these racist ideas real power in a big part of our country. And so I think, for me, it's more realizing, like, changing Derrick Black's mind, I think, took a unique set of circumstances, including age. But if somebody who is that devoted to this and who's been socialized in that space is able to emerge so far on the other side, it gives me some hope that other people who have much less far to go can also be traveling somehow down that same path. So yeah, I think that's part of it.
Sure. Could you spend a moment talking about some of the individuals who use compassion and friendship as a means of connecting with Derrick Black and helping him come to understand the problems of his ideas?
Sure. I'll wind it up to there. But so Derrick, when he went to college, New College was in many ways like the ideological opposite of white nationalism. New College is like it's the honors college of Florida. It's a quirky place, like a lot of students who don't wear shoes, and it sort of values like social justice above all else. For Derrick, it was also the best and cheapest school that he could afford to go to, and it was never in his mind or anybody's mind within the white nationalist movement that anything could possibly change his mind. He was so devoted to these racist ideas. So Derrick decided to go there. He also decided once he got to campus, he knew that what he was saying in his public life would not be received well by New College students. So he made this decision to basically be the most prominent young white supremacist in the world on the radio and in these speeches, but to be a regular college kid at New College. So he would, on campus, he would wake up really early, which in college is like 1 p.m., and would walk to like a quiet spot on the quad, and would call into this radio show where he and his father would rail against the multicultural takeover of the United States and all of these things. And then Derrick would hang up the phone and he would walk back onto campus and he would sort of befriend whoever walked by. And that went on for about 6 months until another student at this college was researching extremist groups and sort of the main threats to the United States on the Southern Poverty Law Center website, was on a hate watch page on this website where they list about the 40 most extreme threats to the United States, and the student on that roll call recognized the picture of the kid he sat next to in math class. So at that point, like, as you can imagine, this little college sort of exploded into a debate that I think all of us are having some version of now, which is, what do you do when you're encountered with like the most horrendous versions of hate speech? Like, how do you go about confronting these ideas, engaging with them? Like what do you do? So at New College, the ideas about that were really different. Some people thought civil resistance, like, let's shut down the school, let's make him feel uncomfortable, let's flip him off if he walks across the quad, let's show him that these ideas are not welcome in this space. Other students basically thought the opposite approach was the way to go. They thought, why don't we try to talk to him? Why don't we see if somehow we can build a relationship with him that will begin to have him question some of these ideas, and particularly for students of color and Jewish students on campus, hoping that maybe if we can get to the point where we build a relationship with him where he can begin to see past the stereotypes to the people, to the humanity. So at the same time, these different approaches began to take place. The first two students to reach out to him were students named Matthew and Moshe. Two Jewish students on this campus. Moshe in particular, a kid from a family of Hungarian Jews that had been all but wiped out at Bergen-Belsen in the concentration camp there at the Holocaust, during the Holocaust. Moshe's childhood had been built on that experience. His grandfather was really the only survivor in this family, and Moshe studied anti-Semitism and learned German and traveled to the concentration camps to connect back to that family history. And then, even though Derrick had espoused these ideas, Moshe decided that what he wanted to do was to try to invite Derrick over for dinner to see if Derrick would come. And because Derrick had been made to feel vulnerable effectively by the protests happening on campus, he was much more likely to say yes to this invitation because he had no other social space. And for the first time, he was feeling some of the vulnerability that he'd made others feel. So those weekly dinners started to happen with Matthew and Moshe and others.
Great. So one more question from a student, and in this case the student, Madeline Tang Adams, was wondering about what you think, but we could also say what Derrick Black thinks of his responsibilities moving forward. So she wrote, what sort of responsibility do you believe that Derrick has when it comes to educating people who still identify as part of the white nationalist movement? Do you feel as though it's his job to help them renounce their ways as well?
I mean, I think the more important perspective to answer from is Derrick's answer, and I think he feels like his responsibility is profound. And I mean, I think he's right. Like I think the damage that he caused is real and is continuing. Like he doesn't know how many people were marching in the streets of Charlottesville because they'd listened to him on the radio every day, or because they'd gone to his white pride site for kids. I think again that's why Derrick thinks the act of pushing back against that is in no way heroic. It's like the fundamentally decent thing to do, and I think he also feels compelled by huge amounts of guilt, rightfully. I also think it's complicated for him because my wish for anybody wouldn't be that they live their entire lives paying an unpayable debt to having been indoctrinated in the first 20 years of their life. But I think right now that's how Derrick feels. And so his, both in his professional life and in his personal life, essentially everything is invested into doing whatever he can to push back as hard from the other side as he once pushed from that side.
Yeah. Thank you.
Sure.
So my next question builds on something you said earlier about the dangers of racist ideology that's really more mainstream. So here I'm going to begin with a quote from Martin Luther King Jr., which I bet many of you will recognize. It's from his letter from a Birmingham jail, which he wrote in 1963. He said, "I must confess that over the past few years, I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice." So, a majority of Americans, to the best of my knowledge, do not self-identify as white supremacists or white nationalists, and most will agree that groups like the Ku Klux Klan or neo-Nazis or people who post on Stormfront are problematic and ideologically dangerous. But I wonder, when we read your book or get really focused on white nationalists, if it is sometimes for a lot of Americans a way to applaud themselves in a sense for not being that extreme,
right.
And to ignore the racism that actually is present in their everyday lives and decisions and actions, things that are much less noticeable because these people aren't hanging up swastikas and burning crosses or marching, but they are doing more subtle things or they are participating in things that are institutionalized racism. So I'm wondering how we can get more people to recognize the racism in their own existence, in their own being. What steps can they take to realize that no, they're not Derrick Black, but there is racism in decisions they make and things they say? Yeah,
I mean, I think that's like the crucial work of this moment in the country and probably going forward for a long time. I mean, I think we've made a mistake in parts of America over the last decades of sort of telling ourselves this story about ourselves that we're a great meritocracy. Like in this country, everybody has an equal shot. That's not true. Our history doesn't bear that out, and like our modern structures don't bear that out. And I think by sort of deluding ourselves in some places in the country with this idea of like a color blindness, which is just not factually correct or possible, it allows these racist ideas more room to grow. I was really interested hearing, talking with Derrick about this recently, where he said that he's found that actually it's much more difficult to do like the active work of being a public anti-racist than it was to do the public work of being a white supremacist. Because when you are advocating for white supremacy, he felt then, and I think still feels now, that he was doing the work of advocating for something that was part and parcel of what America has been. He was saying, hey, this country was built as a country to prioritize the power of white people, and we should continue to do that. When you're doing anti-racist work, you're saying, actually, we have to examine the problems in this country for what they are, and we can't do nothing. Doing nothing allows this to continue to fester. Like, we have to do the active work of looking at the problematical structural racism and interpersonal racism that still informs so much of who we are as a country. So yeah, I think that's, we do comfort ourselves sometimes by thinking, that racism or white supremacy is something that only exists on like the fringes of Stormfront and things like that. The truth is that it's the world that we are all very much still living in, and that's a much harder thing to untangle.
And you used the word anti-racist, which I think is a very important one for people to think about and try to apply, because it points to being active and taking a stance against racism, as opposed to just saying I'm not racist, but thinking about trying to understand some of these divisive issues better and trying to do proactive things.
Yeah, and I think that like particularly in this moment where some of these ideas in their sanitized versions are so much a part of our public space, being silent is too much like being complicit. The stakes are too high. Like that we have to have these difficult conversations and do this work. Otherwise, we continue to go in directions that I think can be pretty scary. Thank you.
So I have two other questions that I'm going to pair together like I did with a couple at the beginning. One was submitted to me by someone I don't know, which is great, because I put a call out for questions and I got a few from people I've not met. I thought that was really exciting. I wanted to hear more voices here. Her name is Selena H., and she is faculty here. And she wrote, how concerned should we be about the perception that public universities are strongly left-wing biased? Does this deter students who could benefit the most from living in an inclusive environment? And the second question is from Jane Waite, who's a senior associate for social justice and learning and engagement here. And it pairs well. She says, given the depth of your experience with organized white supremacy, its intentions and actions, how do you help others differentiate between free speech and hate speech, and the actual harm that hate speech causes, including interrupting educational processes? So we've got questions about, are institutions really so left-wing that they're not friendly to more conservative students, or is that just a perception? And then what kind of speech should be allowed on campuses?
Right. Those are great questions. I think like I'm more qualified in some ways and feel more comfortable almost answering the anti-academia question by my own proxy in my own life, which is an anti-journalism sentiment, or an idea that journalism is equally left-leaning. I think like there's the conversations around those two spaces have a lot of similarities, and I think like there's what I worry about for journalism in particular is that at the Washington Post, at the New York Times, at places like that, there has been explosive audience growth over the last years, and that audience growth has existed mostly on the left in the country. I think there's like a natural inclination in big institutions and for people to begin to cater to the audience that listens to you, right? Like to think, oh, we have all these people reading us, they are on this side, we need to start catering to that side. If that begins to happen, that's like hugely problematic for journalism and what it is. And I would imagine that academia has some of the same challenges. Like it's, I think for me and my job, it's always trying to make sure that what's important is to access and to tell stories from all parts of the country, and that's become much more difficult because probably like working in academia, I now go to certain parts of the country, and for what I do for my job, I'm immediately treated as like, wow, you're doing such important, like heroic work, or it's like Washington Post, fake news, screw you, click. And I have to fight my own impulses to be like, well, it's a lot easier to go write stories about people who think what I'm doing is important and heroic than it is to go into those places and write the equally important stories of people who think I'm fake news. But my job is to still be able to build trust and maintain trust in both of those places, even when it's more difficult. So I hope there's some proxy in there for colleges. I mean, I think like in definitely learning about white nationalist circles, there is a natural distrust for, like a natural anti-establishment feeling. Derrick, as a kid, his parents didn't want him to drink, they only drank filtered water because they thought maybe the government is poisoning your water. He wasn't vaccinated. He wasn't, like a lot of the things that we see manifesting in some ways are a big part of this, like, white nationalism is also sort of a very anti-government movement because they think that the government is like bringing in more multiculturalism into the United States. So I think that sort of goes with some of the anti-academic sentiment as well. And certainly for Derrick, was like, even though Derrick's father, who ran the KKK, he went to college and graduated from the University of Alabama. But now Don Black is definitely talks about college kids as commies and colleges as institutions that he's inherently distrustful of, which is a scary thing.
Sure.
The second part, I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. The other question had to do with issues of free speech on campus, free speech versus hate speech. And I remember earlier today you talked a bit about Richard Spencer and how people have responded to when he's been invited to speak on campuses, and you gave the example of Michigan State that I thought was really interesting. So
right.
Maybe you could actually use Richard Spencer as an example to answer that.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, as a journalist, of course, the First Amendment is foundational to my job and what I do. And I think policing speech can quickly become problematic. So Richard Spencer, who sort of almost rose into Derrick's old position within this movement as the self-described academic racist spokesman. When I was reporting the book, Richard Spencer had announced that he was going to do a college speaking tour. He was going to go to colleges around the country and talk about these racist ideas. And what he was, I know from spending time with him, what he wanted in those situations was conflict. He wanted schools to say, you can't speak here. When that happened, he sued them and usually won, and they were forced to give him space. Or what he got was some huge conflict on the campus that brought more news attention. There were, huge protests that he was there, white supremacists coming from all over the country to fight against those protesters, and Richard Spencer always considered that a huge victory. So the most effective way I saw any school deal with this was at Michigan State, which they decided, the students got together and they said, basically, we are going to respond with absolute silence. The student newspaper isn't going to write about it, we're not going to talk about the fact that he's coming here, and instead of having a protest out front when he comes, what we're going to do is we're going to make sure the auditorium is empty. He can go in there and talk, nobody from our community is going to be in there to listen. And so his visit there was totally silent. There was nobody there to hear him. And they basically said, you can talk, but this is not something we're going to listen to. And I know that was the most powerful, he felt like that was the most disempowering reaction to anything he was trying to do.
Did he talk?
I think he went and was so surprised that nobody was there to hear him that he was like, what's happening, and didn't talk.
I'm amazed the students in the community organized that well.
Yeah, it's a huge amount of organization.
People who showed up.
Totally.
0 is really different
it's
than
pretty great.
5.
Yep.
So, yeah, in terms of making an impact, that's impressive. So I have a question, not one that I had prepared here, but one I was thinking about that actually I had wanted to ask earlier today, which is about the issue of women within white nationalist and white supremacist movements. they tend, at least when we look at who's prominent, to be more male-dominated. There is the story about Richard Spencer, who is now separated from his wife, to whom he was physically abusive recently, and that it seems is not super surprising. What is the role of women in some of these white nationalist movements?
Yeah, it's a great question. So in the weird, awful, insular world of white nationalism, Derrick's mother was previously married to David Duke. So Derrick's mom went to the University of Alabama, met David Duke, they got married, they had 2 kids. David Duke's best friend was Don Black, who they ran the Klan together, then Don took it over. David Duke and Derrick's mother divorced. A few years later, she got married to Don. David Duke was the best man at their wedding. So anyway, Derrick grew up in this household as a kid where he was the youngest of 3 kids. His 2 sisters were David Duke and his mother's daughters. And I was always, this stuff shouldn't be funny, but like there was so much feminist rage from one of Derrick's sisters that she was like, you were only the chosen son because you're a guy. They should have invested everything in me, and I could have led the white nationalist movement, but because I'm a woman, they didn't let me do it. Derrick was always like, she's the most feminist white nationalist I've ever met. It's unfortunately not unlike much of the country, and it's probably not surprising that it's like a very patriarchal culture white nationalism is. Although there's a new-ish movement called Tradwives, which is like heavily Instagram based and like social media space based. That's very much like a women's traditional, like the ideas of like traditional white families as they conceive of them, sharing photos of like those things online and talking about white nationalism, the importance of white nationalism. So there certainly is like plenty of activism from women too, but the most prominent white supremacists, are not surprisingly mostly also chauvinists.
Mm-hmm. So I was wondering if you could, at this point, give us maybe some reading or viewing tips for people who would like to educate themselves further on some of these topics. Is there anything you would suggest that they could jot down, or we could, I suppose I couldn't, I was going to say I could write up a list, but I don't know how to contact all of you, so
right.
They'll have to write it down if they want to.
Yeah, totally. And I can, Rising Out of Hatred, no, I'm just kidding. So we were talking earlier about a book called Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram X. Kendi. It's like the history of racist ideas.
What was the name of that one?
Right there, Stamped from the Beginning. It's always good to do a book talk and hold up somebody else's book, but I'll totally hold it out. This is a really great book, and I would fully recommend it. There's a book about the history of white nationalism, and it's like sort of influenced politically in the country by a guy named Leonard Zeskind. The name of the book at the moment is escaping me, but the last name is Zeskind. Yeah, I mean those are two, without burdening you with tons of reading material. There's like the Ibram X. Kendi book came out last year, maybe 2 years ago, and is like very much it's sort of about how like racist policy fuels racist ideas, and was like a super influential book for me as I was thinking about this stuff. So if you read one, read that one, and then you can read mine next. Yeah, that's a great one.
I really recommend that one as well. He pushes people to, I would say, extend the realm of actions and behaviors they would consider racist. So he talks about 2 forms of racism, and the one that's more obvious to most people would be the segregationists, the people who are very clear that they say, look, one group's or lots of groups are inferior to another group, and therefore they should probably be separated or treated differently. Assimilationist, when you read that book, it will probably be a little distressing, as it was to me, to see some figures, including abolitionists, categorized as assimilationist, but he's done good work, and he is showing you how even some of the, say, abolitionist heroes like William Lloyd Garrison really did have ideas in which they were not at the place where they saw, say, African American people as truly equals. They still thought that, in some cases, that they needed to be reformed more fully, and so on and so forth. So they were not, maybe they could be equal, but they weren't at this point. So he has segregationist, assimilationist, and then what he urges us to be, which is anti-racist. And as they walk through history, beginning with, it goes back into Europe before it gets to North America, doesn't it? So it goes back really far to the origins of racist ideas.
Yep.
Very good.
Yeah. What's that? Stamped from the beginning. Sure. I think like it's also talking about racism and having racist ideas can quickly feel accusatory in conversation, and that makes it a really tough subject to talk about. I think the other thing in a lot of the writing I've done is learning a lot about sort of ingrained bias and subconscious bias, and how these racist ideas are bonded to all of our emotions from very early on in life. Like I was writing recently about police training in parts of the country where they're trying to sort of unwind implicit bias in police officers. And in police simulations, every officer, no matter what color they are, no matter their own background, they shoot the African American person first in the simulations because of the way that racist ideas have been bonded to them about themselves too. So it's this stuff is so deeply rooted that I think that's why the work of untangling it has to be really active work.
Since you mentioned the police training, and that was something that they found was true even of, say, black policemen in training, I decided, I have a quote that I didn't use earlier, but it's from that book, Stamped from the Beginning. The author of it acknowledges that as he did more and more research, he found that he held racist ideas. So I'm going to tell you what he wrote. When I began this book with a heavy heart for Trayvon Martin and Rekia Boyd, I must confess that I held quite a few racist ideas. Even though I am an Africana Studies historian and have been tutored all my life in egalitarian spaces, I held racist notions of black inferiority before researching and writing this book. So just as being a product of the United States. He realized that there were ways that he was also sometimes perceiving black people as inferior, and I think that if he can acknowledge that about himself, then certainly so can the majority of us. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how religion intersects with white nationalism?
Sure. Can you guys hear the questions? Because we can repeat them too. Got it? Repeat? Okay. How religion intersects with white nationalism. So I think Derrick was a little bit unusual in that he grew up in Derrick's father, Don Black, is a committed atheist, a house with almost no religion. And I think actually white nationalism has in some ways increasingly divorced itself from religion in some ways. It's becoming increasingly secular. Certainly there are Christian identitarian movements that take a bastardized version of Christianity and use it as a form of empowerment for racist ideas. But I think that's actually happening a little bit less. The other intersection, I guess obviously that immediately comes to mind with religion and white nationalism is just how much, I was really surprised by how much a part of their ideology is where Jews are in the hierarchy of who they see as their enemies. I think sometimes people don't understand how much anti-Semitism and racism go hand in hand, and within that movement, they're intrinsically tied together. What they believe is that Jews are, with their influence in terms of globalism and Hollywood money and power and banking, are using this position of influence to propagate a scheme of multiculturalism. So in many ways, for Derrick growing up, like Jews were the number one enemy. He said things that were racist often, but like anti-Semitism was the guiding philosophy in some ways. Thanks for asking. Other questions? I feel like we can open it up or yeah. Yes.
So what you just said, with that being the guidance, when did that start historically? Like with that globalization aspect of keeping Jewish? Like when did that trend or that kind of messaging within those movements really start to like take place at the point that people were pushing and speaking about?
Yeah. So when did that start? Like in terms of, I mean, obviously the roots of anti-Semitism are very, very deep, worldwide. But I think in the white nationalist movement in particular, it's like the last 20 to 25 years. And what they would say is that they think that Jews have actually co-opted the Holocaust and are using it as a tool of Zionist aggression to make people feel, guilty about, about what has happened and to sort of use that, turn that power against them. So I think mostly the last 25 years. There also was, white nationalism has changed a lot in that originally for David Duke and Don Black, how they began their life as white nationalists was mostly focused on white, black in the South. Like Don Black would go around to different towns in the South and the KKK would have cross burnings or cross lightings as they call them. And after a while, basically as a strategic tactic, they decided this isn't working for us anymore. This is kind of getting stale. We get the same people at the same parks. We need to broaden out and try to reach like a wider swath of America. So I think part of that was talking more about anti-Semitism and bringing that into the fold. The other part of that was that David Duke and Don Black decided in I think it was 1978, that they wanted to do a 3-week trip where they would try to get the national media to come with them to the Texas border to talk about the need for a wall and the way that immigration was polluting, in their idea, the gene pool and leading to this white genocide. So like around that same time, immigration also became a huge part of their platform.
Yeah, people talk about confronting racism and all that, but the story you tell about Derrick says that he wasn't changed because of confrontation, but because of invitation. And similarly, if you remember Megan Phelps, the daughter of the leader of the
Yes.
Westboro Baptist Church, who also changed, and she changed not because of confrontation, but because of invitation.
Yep.
And similarly, there was a case here in 1993 where a couple of neo-Nazis changed because of invitation.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, does confrontation really work, or should we be concentrating on invitation instead?
I think that's a great question. So confrontation versus invitation and how those two things, the idea of does confrontation in and of itself work, or is invitation and conversation something that's going to have more power to change people's ideas? I would say in the research of this book, it's both, and that it's not even the idea of it being like a mutually exclusive choice. Is sort of a false binary. Like if Derrick hadn't first felt the exclusion on campus, I don't think he would have been open. Well, and this is him. He says he would not have been open to the inclusion, to the invitation. If the invitations hadn't happened, what would have happened? The confrontation just would have driven him further back into his corner. He would have left New College. He would have maybe enrolled somewhere else, and he would have remained a committed white supremacist. Without the invitation, the transformation doesn't take place. So I think, like in terms of how we impact people's thinking, it depends mostly on our point of contact with people. If you have a chance to make the invitation and you personally feel like that's what you want to do, you feel empowered to do it, you don't feel afraid, you feel like somebody might say yes to the invitation, then I think building a relationship with somebody, if that's possible, gives you the greatest chance to change their mind. I think if you don't have any point of contact with somebody, if all you have is like a one quick interaction to send a message that some kind of idea is not okay, then I can understand why what you're doing is confrontation. So I think both of those tactics can have their own effect, and for sure on Derrick, I don't think this story wouldn't have happened without both of them. And I also think both of them took real sustained activism and courage from the people who engaged in them. Because even the people confronting Derrick's ideas, it took a lot of work. Like they they organized a shutdown of an entire college. That sent a really clear message to Derrick that like this kind of ideology is not welcome here, and that was hard to do. And also, I think the problem sometimes with invitation is, and the reason that right now in the country, the idea of civil discourse, I feel like, is sometimes unpopular, even more unpopular than I feel like it should be, is that the idea of invitation can sometimes prioritize the privileged class. Like it's more easy for a conversation between two people to be civil if, for instance, you're both white and neither of you feels threatened by the ideology. But if I'm somebody on campus and this white supremacist is there and he has this massive racist community at his fingertips, I might not feel safe inviting him over to dinner. And I also might not feel like I have a chance to change his mind because he already thinks that I am a lesser human than he is. So, I think it's there's space for all of these tactics, but if it hadn't been for the invitation, there's no way there would have been the transformation.
Hi, how concerned are you about the fact that you can just, a lot of people can go on YouTube, and if they just find one white supremacist video, it suddenly starts recommending 100 more white supremacist videos. I know some friends who get really deep into conspiracy theory web just by starting out on YouTube, and then just they start going way down on that trail. And I feel like that legitimizes or mainstreams the ideology a lot more than it used to be.
Yeah, I think that's totally right. So how concerning is it that basically clicking on one, stumbling onto one white supremacist video based on algorithms and everything else leads you to 100 more? I think the idea of gateways into this world and how powerful and dangerous they are. I think not just with white supremacy, but extremist thought and extremist groups in general, what they try to do to recruit is to build an insular world around somebody, right? So that what they're hoping is that yes, it's the one video that's going to bring you in, but then hopefully you're on this message board or you're in this place where you're surrounded by confirming ideas. And I think that's the reason why Stormfront, in addition to being a website of ideas, is also a place that has meetup groups and its own dating part of the website and everything else. They're trying to build community around people, which becomes a really dangerous indoctrination tactic. So I think the idea that investigating one conspiracy theory or whatever it is can then lead you into a wider world of conspiracy theories, that becomes a really dangerous thing. And yeah, certainly frightening. Thanks for asking about it.
I think we have time probably for one more question, and then Eli is going to be out there signing books, and that would also be another opportunity for you to ask questions. So, yes.
This kind of builds off the idea of invitation versus confrontation, but what advice do you have for white people, specifically younger white people, to kind of transition from a bystander to an anti-racist?
Yeah, great question. So advice for people in terms of how to transition from a bystander to an anti-racist. That's been a question I've asked myself a lot in doing, in the process of writing this book. Some of it for me has been realizing that we all have points of contact with these ideas, unfortunately, because the ideas are very widespread. So within my own extended family, there are plenty of people who hold ideas that I know are racist at the root. If I told them that they were racist, that wouldn't get me very far in those conversations. But I know that they have problematic ideas. And one thing for me has been if Moshe can sit at dinner with Derrick for 2 years and talk in the German they've learned because of their divergent family histories, then maybe I should have the courage to have some uncomfortable conversation with the people in my life who might listen to me. So for me, that's been a part of it. I think also on the new college campus, things that people did that were helpful were making sure that they were making people of color feel safe, uplifting voices of people of color on campus, making sure that it was, and I think that was part of the confrontation of Derrick that was impactful, was just confirming to those students who felt vulnerable that this was a place that valued them and that was not going to let these ideas be spoken loudly on this campus space. So I think that's something that the active work of prioritizing those voices is an important thing too. Thanks for asking.
That was a great question for us to end on. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks so much, everybody. Really appreciate you coming. Thank you. Thanks for all the great questions.